Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Patrick Tucker, Technology Editor at Defense One, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the final event in this year's virtual edition of our annual Outlook Summit. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. In the top right-hand corner of your screen, you will see a Q&A tab. This is where you can ask your questions to Senator King and Representative Gallagher. I encourage you to submit any questions you have along the way so we have time to get to as many as possible. Senator King has votes this morning at about 11:45. He might have to duck out to do the nation's work, not being rude, just doing the job that his constituents gave him. So hope to get to everything by then. Also at the top right-hand corner of your screen, you're going to find a message icon. That is where you can chat and interact with our fellow attendees or ask for technical assistance. This event is being recorded and will be available on demand shortly after for you to share with your colleagues. Encourage you to do so. And so with no further ado, I would like to welcome Senator Angus King and Representative Mike Gallagher. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here today.
Great to be with you and looking forward to the conversation.
Likewise.
All right. Let's get to it. You guys have spearheaded a number of great cybersecurity provisions for the new defense bill, chaired a big Cyber Solarium Commission report that had a number of recommendations for improving the United States' cybersecurity posture. 26 of those recommendations from the Cyber Solarium Commission have made it into the most recent National Defense Authorization Act. I want to get to those. But we have a rare occasion this week to highlight the importance of government cybersecurity, as the government has disclosed that a growing number of agencies were the victim of a massive breach through a third-party vendor called SolarWinds. In addition to Commerce and Treasury, we now know that DHS was a victim, and the bad news on this is sort of like a leaky faucet. It seems to just keep dripping, and so there's no sign of stopping. This is a very developing story. I know that even at the highest levels of government, we don't have a full understanding of the impact of the entire story yet. I also understand there have been a number of classified briefings on the Hill. So to kind of set the stage for why cybersecurity and the new cybersecurity provisions in the NDAA are so important, I wonder if both of you, starting with you, Senator, can tell us what have you learned about this SolarWinds breach recently that you can share with the public?
Well, first, I would say if I was back in my old trial lawyer mode right now, I would say I rest my case. This breach makes the case for the work that we've been doing over the past year and a half on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission and the items that we've gotten into the defense bill. And let me just say parenthetically, when you add all together what's in the National Defense Authorization Act this year on cyber, this is the most important bill on cyber ever passed by Congress. And that's why I'm really hoping that the president will either sign the bill or let it become law without his signature, because there is so much critically important material in the bill. Now, to get back to your question, I can't share with you anything that's classified, but I think what we know is that this was a really serious breach. And the disturbing thing not only is the departments that you've mentioned, and there may be more, but this goes back months. The intrusion goes back probably into the spring sometime, which makes you wonder, what have they been up to all that time? And I think it underlines for people that this is not an abstract problem. I mean, these are government agencies, and I'm sure somebody in Dubuque says, well, what am I worried about that? Well, what if it were the electric grid? What if it were the financial system? What if it were the airline air traffic control system? I mean, this is a warning shot of all warning shots to tell us, how vulnerable we are and how serious the consequences should be. So we've really got to double down on cyber defense. If ever there was any doubt, it's been resolved over the last 2 or 3 days.
Senator Representative Gallagher, do you have any insight that you can share on this breach and its possible impact on government?
Well, I haven't actually not been privy to any classified briefings. So what I'm about to say is purely based on what I've read, open source, and my own attempt to decipher FireEye's analysis of it, I mean, it does appear massive in scale. I mean, in some ways, it's the hack of the decade. I'm trying to think of a global intrusion campaign, to use FireEye's phrase, that would rival this in scope. And as the senator rightly pointed out, the fact that it went undetected for so long is a testament not only to the tradecraft of SVR relative to GRU, if indeed that's the source of it, but also I think the complacency of the federal government. And I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that it was FireEye, not the U.S. government, that first identified the attack. And I think that shows both the importance of strengthening public and private partnerships for collective defense, while also underscoring the reality that the U.S. government, as currently constituted, is not organized to successfully defend itself or our critical infrastructure in cyberspace, as Senator King rightly pointed out.
Senator Dick Durbin has said that this Russian cyber attack, if it is Russian, there have been a couple of attributions of it in popular press. I think Secretary of State has attributed it to Russia, and Senator Blumenthal has, not a formal attribution from other parts of government yet. But Senator Dick Durbin has said this is virtually a declaration of war. To me and to a lot of people, there's a big difference between what we're seeing here and, say, publishing stolen emails to influence an election, or locking down hospital computers, or destroying data. This looks to some people much more like conventional espionage. So to both of you, what do you think is the appropriate response toward whatever state actor has done this, if it is Russia or someone else?
Well, the first thing I would say is, we'll talk about response in a minute, but I will say no response is not appropriate. Mm-hmm. And that's been our national policy by and large for the past 10 or 15 years. One of the things that our commission did a lot of work on and really pointed out is that below the threshold of force, below a catastrophic attack, we don't have a deterrent. Our adversaries, and this is a perfect example, don't feel that they have much at risk by coming after us, whether it's in the election of 2016 or in this hack, or name it, name your poison. And that's been one of the real problems that we've tried to address. I want somebody in the Kremlin sitting around that table to say, wait a minute, boss, if we do this, we're liable to get whacked in some way. And right now, they're not making that calculus. I'll never forget asking the NSA director several directors ago, is the fear of a cost being imposed by the United States part of the calculus of our adversaries in planning a cyber attack? And his answer was no. That's one of the things we have to change. So I don't want to define what the response should be, sanctions. And by the way, it ought to be multilateral sanctions. This is a global problem, or whatever. I'm not going to define it, but I just believe that there should be a response. It should be prompt once the attribution is clear, and it should be costly. Otherwise, they're going to keep coming. Why not? We're a cheap date right now, and we've got to be more responsive, or this is just going to be the beginning.
Rep. Gallagher?
Yeah, I think based on what I know now, this seems more like a coordinated espionage campaign as opposed to an attack. And if it were more the latter, more of sort of like a fancy bear approach as opposed to cozy bear, then I think we could start throwing around those terms of active war and things like that. I'm just not sure we're there yet, but I very much agree with Senator King that there needs to be some response, and until those responsible feel pain in response to this intrusion, we can expect more of this to happen. But I do think part of our response has to not only be punitive towards the perpetrators, but introspective. I mean, we have to have a federal government that is more capable of detecting intrusions like this. And I think that's why it's so important to get some of these NDAA recommendations across the finish line. There are some things in there that are an outgrowth of our report which I can't promise you 100% would have prevented something like this, but I do think would have put us in a position of detecting it more quickly and responding more quickly. Perhaps foremost among them is just giving CISA the authority to do threat hunting on .gov networks, because you just need someone who's capable of looking across the interagency and into the private sector, or coordinating with the private sector, to start to detect patterns. And I hate to say it, but I just don't think the CIOs and all these different agencies are capable of doing that right now. We had another recommendation on doing threat hunting on the defense industrial base networks. We didn't quite get all of that in the NDAA, but we got a feasibility study in the NDAA. So that's something that I do think would directly improve our ability to detect and potentially prevent things like this in the future.
Yes, that's section 1705, because I'm sort of familiar with the thing. It grants CISA the power to do threat hunting on federal government networks. There's also a provision, and I think this is in the NDAA, that gives CISA the power to issue administrative subpoenas to internet service providers when it detects critical infrastructure security vulnerabilities. Tell us, is that in the NDAA as well? I know it was one of the recommendations.
Yes, that's in there. You're right. You've done your homework. That is one of the provisions that's in there, and the reason that's important is if we detect a threat to, let's say, a utility, we don't know who the utility is because it's masked as it comes through the ISP. All this administrative subpoena, which sounds sort of scary, is that CISA can go to the ISP and say, "We've seen this threat. Who's your customer?" So we can warn them. I mean, that's really what it is, and it was supported throughout the Congress, and it is in the bill, and I think it's an important piece. Yes, Mike Gallagher is absolutely right, as he usually is. Resilience has got to be part of this as well. I'm a big believer in pen testing. I'm a big believer in every CIO thinks they've got it all covered. And it's only when a skull and crossbones appears on the boss's laptop that you realize maybe you're not as invulnerable as you thought. And the way to do that is to facilitate and have a constant program of our own people, hackers for hire or bug. I think in the Pentagon a couple of years ago, they called it the bug bounty program. We've got to have our own people looking for these vulnerabilities, so that we find them first and patch them rather than the adversary find them.
Yeah, bug bounties are, it's a tool that a lot of white hat hackers use. It's very common in the private cybersecurity landscape. You basically pay a red team to go out and find all of the vulnerabilities that might be in your network or might be part of your outward facing website or whatever. And they do the hacking work before the enemy does. In theory, It's supposed to work very well. That was under the bug bounty programs in the Defense Department, were under Chris Lynch originally at the Defense Digital Service. Do you think that that's the sort of thing that could work across all of government? It works well for the Defense Department, but that's a singular agency that's very defense focused. Do you think that you might run into obstacles trying to create that sort of bug bounty form of security assurance for other agencies?
Well, because it's government, of course you're going to encounter obstacles. I mean, that's almost by definition. For example, we had a provision for pen testing and bounty, bug seeking, red teaming on state systems as part of an election security bill, and the states just rose up and said, "Oh no, you can't do that," and they hated it. But I think it's necessary. There may be obstacles, but the threat hunting on the .gov domain, I think, is a big deal. And as Mike said, that's in the bill. We got to get this bill over the line. It's passed both houses by huge majorities, and the president literally has it on his desk today. And I wish he would either sign it or let it become law without his signature, because if he vetoes it, because of the timing, the bill could be lost altogether. We'd have to start all over again in January, which would really be a tragedy for the national security of this country.
Right. So the bill does have a number of provisions for CISA, for the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. Really beefs it up in a lot of respects. CISA's former director, Chris Krebs, who led the agency, he's championed this bill. He says that it's very urgent that it be passed. So he agrees with you on this. He's also said that the most recent election was the most secure in history. Since you want to give CISA these new authorities, how would you rate that agency's performance in the last year dealing with this election?
Well, I think they did a phenomenal job, and I really think there is a story that needs to be told, not only about CISA, but about General Nakasone and his team, and the way in which a group of dedicated professionals, both at NSA, Cyber Command, and CISA, learned lessons from the 2016 election, applied those lessons to both the 2018 midterm and the 2020, and how dedicated professionals DoD were able to use the concept of defend forward and persistent engagement in order to prevent foreign countries from meddling in our elections. So I would give them very high marks, and that's part of the reason why we evaluated a variety of different proposals, including the creation of an entirely new cyber agency. I mean, there's a variety of people think there are different ways you can reform the federal government to have a better posture in cyber. But ultimately, we came to believe that the nation would be best served if we elevated and empowered CISA to do the job that it was meant to do, and in so doing, build upon the great work of Director Krebs and others. And we think, we said it in our chairman's letter. We know that federal government jobs can never compete with the private sector on salary, but we can compete on mission. I mean, the reason the NSA is able to recruit the best and the brightest is it's a cool mission. There are things you can do there you can't do anywhere else, and we want the same to be said of CISA. We want CISA to compete with Google for top-level talent and win, because people believe fundamentally in the important mission.
Mm-hmm. One of the other sections of the bill, Section 1733, I thought was very interesting based on my experience covering cybersecurity, creates a pilot program to use speed-based metrics to measure the performance and efficacy of DoD security providers. So kind of watching the breakout speed of any intrusion and how fast a different network administrator, a different network manager can deal with that breakout, so that you can potentially catch something before it leaps from one place to another. You were all just talking about how kind of frustrating it was that this vulnerability may have been something that the adversaries were exploiting since the spring. We've heard March. Talk a little bit about that Section 1733 and that pilot program to use speed-based metrics to measure performance and efficacy of cybersecurity. Why is that important?
Well, I think the key word you use is metrics. One of my favorite sayings about government, or anything else for that matter, is, does it work and how do you know? And quite often we don't know, because we don't measure, we don't have the metrics. So the idea is and there's several provisions, as you know, in the bill and in our recommendations about statistics and gathering data and sharing data much more quickly. One of the problems that we tried to address in a big way in the recommendations that are in the defense bill is the silo problem. Mm-hmm. And we have, I want to say, we have really good silos, but they're still silos. And so probably the biggest recommendation that's in the defense bill is the creation of a national cyber director mm-hmm. at the executive office of the president, confirmed by the Senate. So there's somebody every day who gets up in the morning thinking about this threat throughout the federal agencies, but also in the private sector, an interface for the private sector. And the provision you mentioned is an important one, because it does give us the metrics and to try to determine what happens. But my concern is, you're the CIO in the EPA, and you detect a problem. That same problem may be unfolding at Commerce or at the Treasury. And we've got to have a better way to integrate this data and share information. And by the way, the same problem goes with the private sector. And we're talking about a new model. It ain't natural for the private sector to trust the government. And we've got to really build, and that was one of the things Chris Krebs did most successfully, was to build a relationship of trust with all the states and the election officials so that this election could be the most secure in American history. And that relationship was so important. So the relationship between the departments, between the government and the private sector is very much part of this. And to go back to your original question, having the data really will help us, I think, to achieve a much better integration.
Okay. I want to remind the audience to get your questions in while we still have time to get to them. Sorry to cut you off, Congressman. Please go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add, there's a reason if you read our chairman's letter, I think we have the word speed and agility bolded about 5 times. And it's because, to a greater extent than we tend to appreciate in government policy circles, we have to speed up our response times in cyber. I mean, if it takes the average adversary just under 5 hours to break out in a target network or achieve enough control to achieve their objectives, that means in order to avoid a breach, you have to identify and contain the intruder in less time than it takes them to break out. That's why you've seen emerging best practices like the 1-10-60 rule, where you identify activity, malicious activity in 1 minute, you have someone investigate within 10, and then you remediate the issue within 60. And so the challenge, and where we do think the National Cyber Director can be very helpful, is to develop a culture in the federal government of speed and agility in responding to cyber incidents in a federal government that, as Senator King rightly points out, was not built or optimized for speed and agility. So it's a challenge, to be sure, and it's a sort of a delicate balance we try to strike in our recommendations.
Yeah. So this one provision, reestablishing cybersecurity leadership in the White House, creating a national cyber director position. There had been a White House cyber coordinator, and I think that it was John Bolton that kind of did away with the position. So to your mind, had some sort of coordinator position or even a director position, had that been in place at the beginning of this year, do you think that that might have prevented or at least mitigated the damage of the SolarWinds breach?
I think well, you go ahead, Mike.
Well, I was going to say, and maybe I'll speak for myself, not the commission here. I think it's our view that the status quo prior to Bolton's change was not sufficient itself. And that position, while important, was not sufficiently empowered in the way a national cyber director truly would be. And a lot of it depends on the president's views of these issues, the president's personal relationship with his or her cyber people. But the reason that we made the national cyber director Senate confirmed is to give it a level of prominence and power, regardless of that would transcend sort of NSC organizations or the particular personalities that occupy that position or the presidency.
Do you have something, Senator King? Well, I guess maybe we
No,
lost
I think with his usual brilliance and insight, Gallagher covered it.
He's never this nice to me. This is a rare day. It's because we miss each other. We got so used to doing this road show together, we haven't been able to hang out.
Right. And now, it's so tricky trying to do government remotely. Sort of side note, how well do you think the government and in general, the Senate and the House have risen to the challenge of trying to conduct business remotely? Because that presents sort of a unique IT problem and challenge in itself. How do you rate it?
Well, I'll speak on the Senate side. Mike can talk about the House. Most of our committee meetings now have the capacity to be either live or remote. I say most. I'm on the Intelligence Committee. We can't do a secure Intelligence Committee meeting, so those are in person. So we're in the skiff downstairs. The buzzer is the Senate floor telling us something's going on, maybe a vote, but I think I've got a while. Anyway, I think it's worked fairly well. We're still voting in person. It still strikes me as a little crazy to have 100 people gather in one big room for 20 minutes or a half hour milling around. We ought to be able to vote electronically. They do it in the House. The Republic hasn't collapsed because of that. And I think that's something that we really need to think about. Robert Byrd, the dean of the Senate, would roll over in his grave to talk about electronic voting in the Senate. But I think it's something we really do need to think about. The risk level in the Senate has been higher than it should have been. I think in part because many of the members, frankly, didn't take it all that seriously. Some did. Interestingly, it was partisan. The Republican senators, for example, had their live in-person caucus lunch every Tuesday, I think, until the last couple of weeks. The Democrats started having their Tuesday lunches virtual on Zoom months ago, either a conference call or Zoom back in the spring. So it's a matter of how seriously it's been taken. But I think we've done reasonably well, but could have done better. I'm in a little basement office in the Capitol right now. I haven't been to my regular office in the Hart Senate office building since March. I'm working entirely from home or this one room office where it's just me, and I go up when I have to vote, and that's it. And then I come straight back, and everybody is wearing masks. That's a good thing. It took a while to get there, but everybody except Rand Paul, I should say. Rand Paul doesn't wear a mask, but everybody else does.
That's good. That's good to hear. I want to stick with the Intelligence Committee for a second, and just in general, an area that both of you have talked a lot about and very passionate about, and that is the current state of what I think a lot of people just call competition with China and Russia. It was a big part of the national defense strategy, the national security strategy that over the last few years, 2017 on, that focus on actually competing against China and Russia, where do you think that goes in the next few years with a new administration? And what are you looking to see happen to improve U.S. position in that competition?
I'm happy to take a stab first here. I think at a time when Congress is very divided and America is very divided, I think there is a striking amount of consensus when it comes to the issue of long-term competition with communist China. And I do think that there is a great deal of bipartisan buy-in to the fundamental premise of the recent national security strategy and national defense strategy. And I know, Senator King and myself would quibble with certain aspects of the Trump administration's foreign policy, rhetoric and treatment of allies, perhaps foremost among them. But when it comes to just the basic prioritization, I think a lot of people agree, and Senator King has been willing to praise the actions of the administration on China when they are realistic and hard nosed, and I think that presents a huge opportunity for us to maintain that bipartisan spirit and build off that bipartisan foundation for foreign policy going forward. I think this administration will have to make some very important decisions early on, both in terms of personnel and their approach to China. I think to the extent there is an emerging division between some of the rhetoric that John Kerry is using, talking about a return to a more cooperative approach, I think, and the rhetoric of others in the incoming administration that have a more realistic approach, that's something that needs to be resolved. And I think anyone telling you that we can go back to the status quo ante of a rapprochement with communist China, I think is being naive. And so I think we have, I guess, bottom line, an opportunity to maintain an emerging bipartisan consensus when it comes to competing successfully with China. But that will also in turn require us to make investments domestically that we just haven't been making on securing our supply chains, securing our medical supply chain in particular. I think that's going to be one of the biggest lessons of the pandemic, is that we just can't be dependent on an occasionally hostile foreign power for the manufacturing of basic goods and devices.
I think the challenge of China is really complex. I've heard it referred to as the Second Cold War or the New Cold War or just the Cold War. It's infinitely more complex than the original Cold War. The original Cold War was U.S. and Russia. It was a competition of arms, basically. It was building up, NATO. They were building up their forces, and there were these tension points like Berlin. But this relationship, there wasn't a hell of a lot of trade going on between Russia and the U.S. or the West, and it wasn't a very, I'd call it an entangled relationship. China's entirely different. I mean, they have control of a lot of rare earth minerals, for example, supply chain issues, as Mike mentioned, the trade, the interrelationship on trade, and yet at the same time, they're building up their military. They're sticking their noses into the Arctic. I was at a conference a couple of years ago where there were a whole lot of Chinese. It was about the Arctic. And the Chinese, I said, why are you here? And they said, well, we're a near Arctic nation. I said, well, that means my state of Maine is a near Caribbean state. I mean, give me a break. They're sticking their tentacles everywhere around the world. So a very complicated situation that's going to have to involve, alternatively, hard-nosed drawing lines and clear opposition. On the other hand, there are areas, for example, in climate change, where we have a lot in common. We need both economies have to literally clean up their act if we're going to do something about the threat of climate change, which is a mutual threat to both countries. So all I'm trying to say is it may be Cold War 2.0, but I'd call it Cold War 2.367 because it's much more difficult to manage than a simple what amounted to a standoff in arms in the 50s and 60s.
What's something specific we can do in terms of policy, in terms of posture, et cetera, something specific we can do that we haven't done yet to further turn this competition in our favor?
I'll just quickly nominate a massive investment in research and development from the federal government in partnership with our best universities, and ensuring that investment doesn't just get concentrated on the West and East Coast. I'll make an exception for the great state of Maine, which I am very fond of since Angus has become one of my good friends. But I just think we're going to have to harness the innovation, the entrepreneurship that exists at the intersection of higher education and industry, and it's going to require the federal government to make some investments that, quite frankly, have been declining dramatically since the end of the original Cold War.
I think, and to carry forward with what Mike said, we're going to have to talk about, dare I say it, industrial policy. We're going to have to decide that we have to subsidize, support, encourage, incent certain industries, semiconductors, just in order to maintain the supply chain for the critical building blocks of a 21st century economy. And the Chinese have figured this out. I mean, Huawei is a private company, but it has the support of the Chinese government. They're helping them to sell their products cheaply around the world, and therefore they get money, but they also get access to other people's intelligence. I mean, it's a perfect example of a state and private sector working in conjunction with one another. That's totally alien to our whole system of private enterprise and the separation of the government and the private sector. But we really need, I call it, the Chinese are engaged in mercantilism 2.0. And we've got to figure that out and really be looking in that direction. The other thing, I hesitate to even utter these words. If I were president, I think one of the things I would want to do is learn Mandarin and spend a couple of weeks with Xi Jinping and say, what is it you want? What is it you want? What do we want? And where can we work together? And where can we manage conflict and confrontation and competition? There's a lot of sort of supposition of, what is it the Chinese are doing? Every hearing I'm in with the high-ranking military or State Department people, I always ask the same question. What does China want? And I think that's an important question. We shouldn't assume that they want to invade all the countries that are in their region. Is it purely economic? Is it military? Is it, cultural, social, whatever it is? We need to understand that. And I don't think we're not very good in the U.S. in understanding the culture and history of other countries. This is a, 4 or 5 thousand-year-old civilization. They think in very long terms. And I think we tend to think transactionally. We need to think more strategically.
Can I two-finger off that, Angus? I think you raise well, first of all, as you know, in America, a king cannot be president.
I know.
Oh, we might be running out of time if that's going to continue.
All right, well, I emphatically agree that we don't do a great job at developing deep regional expertise like we did in the old Cold War. We just don't have a lot of George Kennans with that hover over that target and understand the culture and the politics very well. And I think we need, in particular, an understanding of certain things like Chinese United Front work and how that is presenting problems and infiltrating our democracy right now. So I just emphatically agree with Angus's comments.
Do you think there's any appetite right now from a Biden administration, such that you can perceive it, for either of those two big recommendations, for increased spending in research and development at the federal level, as well as reform of industrial policy, possibly even subsidization of things like the semiconductor industry? Is that something that there's appetite for right now from the incoming administration that you can detect?
I don't have an answer to that. I know Tony Blinken, for example, and I've talked to Jake Sullivan, who's the incoming national security advisor, but I don't really. I mean, we haven't gotten to the point of policy discussions, but these are smart people. Avril Haines, who's going to be director of national intelligence, extremely capable person, and I think they're versed in the sort of overall strategic issues. But this is not an easy. There are no simple answers to this. Let me tell you one quick anecdote that I think underlines what Mike and I were talking about. I met a guy several years ago who was about my age, and you say, "Where are you from?" He said, "Well, I was born in Japan," and I did the math and realized that would have been about 1945 or 46. He was an American. I said, "Well, how come you were in Japan?" He said, "My father was a professor at Michigan State or someplace in Japanese culture and history. And MacArthur hired him to come and help him draft the Japanese Constitution after the war to ensure that it was consistent with Japanese culture and history." I thought that was genius. And I don't think that's the norm. We tend to think the rest of the world thinks like us. Mm-hmm. And they have the same kind of values, the same kind of way of thinking, linear. And I thought that was one of a really important insight that MacArthur had, and we could use a lot more than that. I don't mean to beat this subject to death, but I think we really do get in trouble in our foreign relations by assuming everybody else either thinks like us or wants to be us, and alas, that's just not true.
Well, one of the recommendations that has come out of the military establishment for better competing with China is a big increase in the size of the U.S. Navy. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Milley, has said that their aim is for a 500-ship Navy by 2045. That's a big increase from where it is today. As you look at that sort of proposal amidst the wide number of other demands that you'll be looking at for future NDAAs, for future budget allocations, where do you think that sort of proposal stands? Is that a realistic thing to begin to work on in terms of allocating budget, or is that going to compete too hard with other demands in a sort of resource-stretched environment post-COVID?
I'm laughing because you're talking to two guys who represent shipbuilding districts. Mike, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, well,
we think it's a great idea.
Okay,
yeah,
I know.
Two navalists on this call. You won't get any objections from us. But there's a lot to like in the new 30-year shipbuilding plan, and it comes out of Battle Force 25, which is the first force structure assessment since the 2018 National Defense Strategy. And what's revolutionary about the plan, as I read it, are really two things: the size of the fleet and the composition of the fleet. So, we didn't have, in the previous plan, we didn't have the fleet growing to 355 until FY34. This gets us to 355 within the decade and then grows the fleet, excluding unmanned systems, to 405 in the out years. And when you look at the composition, we're buying more small surface combatants like we build in my district and fewer large surface combatants. That to me is essential when you look at just the topography, of Indo-PACOM. And so in particular, we're making an investment in Virginia class subs, which is really your first priority if things pop off with the PLA Navy, particularly if comms go down. So I think this is good progress, but the elephant in the room is that, and in this case, in the middle of the Biden administration's future defense budget, is that the plan is coming in the last days of the Trump administration. And so this is exactly the type of plan I wanted to see in 2017 or in 2018 or even in 2019, not in the waning days of 2020.
Let me mention one sort of subtle issue here is how we budget. And a new Virginia-class submarine, for example, is a 40-year asset. But we budget for it in the federal budget as a cash expenditure the day it's built or over the several years that it's built. And there's no, believe it or not, the federal budget there's no capital budget. Everything is operations. There are things that are legitimately long-term capital assets that ought to be budgeted in a different way and accounted for in a different way. And that's one of the problems. The shipbuilding budget could eat the whole Navy budget over the next 5 to 10 years unless it's, unless we manage it properly. It's critically important, but in many ways, and this goes to the nuclear triad, we are now paying for years of lack of maintenance so that we've got these huge capital expenditures to maintain our nuclear deterrent. And that's something that we're really going to have to face up to. I think it's going to be difficult. One final point about the budget, because I get, a lot of people say we're spending too much, the federal budget's too big. Defense as a percentage of GDP is about the lowest right now it's been in the last 50 years. And domestic discretionary spending as a percent of GDP is at the lowest it's been in about 50 years. When people talk about spending in Washington, the costs that are driving the budget deficits are Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, principally the cost of healthcare. People don't realize that the sort of what we call the discretionary budget, defense and non-defense, is essentially flat and has been for quite some time, has actually been declining in the last 25 or 30 years. So, that's an important point. I get people who say, we're spending too much on defense. As a percent of the federal budget, as a percent of GDP, it's way below where it was 25, 30 years ago.
All right. Well, I think that's going to give us a lot to talk about as a country going forward into 2021, where we can potentially find cost savings in some of those other areas, and how we go about funding defense and the big priorities that you mentioned, because there's a lot of things on the to-do list. But with that, right now, I know you have votes, Senator. So Senator King and Representative Gallagher, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. That is all the time that we have, but please be sure to stay tuned for a word from our exclusive underwriter, Cisco. And thank you all for joining us for Defense One's Outlook 2021. Have a very safe and happy holiday.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us.
Right,
I'm Daniela Fair, publisher at Defense One, and I'm excited to continue today's conversation with Sean Robertson. Sean is Senior Operations Director of DoD at Cisco. Thanks for joining me today, Sean.
Thanks, Danielle. It's a pleasure to speak with you again.
Sean, I'm hoping you can just take a moment before we get into our discussion, just to tell the audience a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you arrived at the current role you have at Cisco.
Absolutely. So I have responsibility for the Cisco's Department of Defense business. I've been in this role for about a year. Prior to this role, I ran Cisco's architecture business for federal. That's where we developed our first hosted cloud collaboration solution for government. And prior to Cisco, I spent time at Oracle and CA. So my background prior to Cisco is primarily in the application space.
Great. I think that really helps our audience understand your point of view. The DoD is facing multiple challenges, to include various multi-vendor approaches to the DoD enterprise environment. Some of the issues, as outlined by various senior leaders across DoD, is bridging the tactical edge to the enterprise environment, supporting episodic demands, building resilient infrastructure to scale technology, and addressing data silos. So I'm hoping you can help start by just telling us what are some of your thoughts on how Cisco can help DoD address these particular challenges.
Yes, so the goal is to enable mission success without the worries of technology. Technology should enable the mission and not be a hindrance. The recently published DoD data strategy vision statement highlights that the DoD is a data-centric organization. It uses data at speed and scale for operational advantage and increased efficiency. Additionally, it recognizes that data is a strategic asset and therefore it must be operationalized. Having said that, it's critical to take a platform approach when talking about edge to cloud, and you must build a foundation when you're going to operationalize data. Cisco's approach is to help the DoD build a foundational platform for their operations. We recognize that to do that, to provide all of the necessary, we do not provide all the necessary pieces and parts and solutions or parts that go into the solution. We know that the DoD is going to operate in a multi-vendor environment. And these are similar challenges that we see facing all of our customers, not just the DoD. It's why Cisco's made it a priority to really develop solutions with open APIs to support third-party integrations. It's also why Cisco's made an investment to establish a DevNet community.
So let me ask you this, Sean. Can you share with our audience like a particular example or examples of Cisco enabling multi-vendor interoperability?
Yeah, so there's two good examples. So the first is our Cisco HCSD, and that's a hosted cloud collaboration solution, and it's Impact Level 5. And it's the only Impact Level 5 collaboration solution available to the DoD today. It is an open standard cloud option, and it allows for seamless integration into Microsoft. So it allows them to deliver demand collaboration capabilities to service members. Because it's a cloud offering, it offers flexibility, simplicity, and most important, affordability. It allows for faster deployment of new services, as most cloud solutions do. The second example is really around security and zero trust. We all hear the importance of, and the DoD's focused on a zero trust architecture. Cisco's zero trust architecture secures connections of applications, microservices, or containers, regardless if they reside in a data center or a cloud, or in the soon-to-be Microsoft Jedi Cloud. And knowing that the security architectures were always going to be multi-vendor, Cisco developed an exchange grid called PX Grid. And so what PX Grid allows the DoD to do is to really integrate multiple security products, and then allows them to have the ability to share data and work together. This will be a key to the DoD as they move forward with the zero trust architecture.
So you mentioned.
I was going to add one to that. We recognize that all of our solutions are going to reside in multi-vendor environments, as we just mentioned with security. We've made a significant investment in the DevNet platform, which environment and community, what I mentioned earlier. And this allows third-party unique government solutions to be easily integrated into the Cisco platforms. And the commitment to the go ahead. I'm sorry, Danielle.
No, that's quite all right. Go ahead.
So our commitment to DevNet can be shown by that we've introduced certifications for our DevNet environments into our Cisco networking academies, and the services use our Cisco networking academies as part of their formal training process.
Got it. That's what I was going to ask about on DevNet on that front. Does DevNet provide an interoperability platform other than security? Because you're using that as an example.
Absolutely. It supports numerous platforms, including networking, IoT, mobility, data center, and collaboration, which I mentioned earlier.
Great. So, Sean, give me an example of a DoD customer leveraging these capabilities. I'm sure our audience wants to hear about those pilots out there or programs that are operating right now.
So absolutely. So the first one that comes to mind is the virtual pilot ship within the Navy. And that's, they're looking at the weapon systems on the Aegis class submarine. And they use the Cisco platform, which is essentially a cloud deployed on the ship. And it's an open standard software-based platform that allows integration with all solutions. It allows to give them capabilities to the sailors seamlessly and to build ad hoc services. And so it's currently been deployed on an Aegis class ship and is out for testing as we speak.
There's been a lot of buzz about 5G lately. I know at Defense One, we're certainly covering it a lot and plan to be discussing it into 2021. How does Cisco play in 5G for the Department of Defense?
That's a great question. So obviously, it's been top of mind in the DoD, and it's also very much top of mind for Cisco. Often when folks think about 5G, they think about the RF component of it, or the radio frequency component. And what 5G does is it really increases the ability to deliver capabilities out at the edge, but it also allows for additional capacity. So adding a lot more connected devices. Think Internet of Things, right? It's a big place there. With the increase in capacity and the increase in the number of connected devices, the question becomes, will their infrastructure be able to support or provide security and agility to support these additional connections? And what Cisco brings together is our software-defined capability in the networking, along with private 5G, to provide the robust platform that will improve the productivity and efficiency in the critical operations. We're currently engaged in supporting initiatives in 5G in areas around manufacturing today. In some of the other areas where it's going to be very, it's going to help provide solutions to be around warehousing, shipyards, and depots.
Sean, to bring us full circle, and I know you mentioned IBN, or intent-based networking. How does IBN enable DoD interoperability?
Yeah, so an architectural approach driven by intent-based networking, and we talked a little bit earlier about operationalizing data, is really around the mission thread from the edge to the cloud. And this integrated approach will enable the DoD to better manage and control the resiliency, security, and performance when you start talking about delivering services to the edge all the way from the cloud. It helps assure the delivery of highly reliable, available services the DoD requires for successful missions.
Well, Sean, I think you and I could probably spend hours talking about this. There's just so much to cover, but I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with me today and share your insights with our audience. I think it's been a very valuable conversation. I certainly learned something. And I want to thank Cisco for supporting this year's Defense One's Outlook 2020 as our elite underwriter. Today's program certainly would not be possible without their partnership. Many thanks to our audience for being with us today. We encourage you to tune in to our other Defense One Outlook sessions and share them with your colleagues who might be interested. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Daniela.